So we're halfway through the gardening year now, and I've harvested about £4,100 worth of fruit and veg so far. So there's been plenty of opportunity for things to go wrong, and there certainly has been plenty of things that have gone wrong this year. So I thought I'd go through that list and talk a little bit about them and whether there's a lesson learned there, or whether there's a kind of mitigation strategy that can be applied, or something that I'm going to try next year to try and work around the problem. So the first thing is that all of my onions, pretty much all of my onions, bolted this year. So those are all the overwintered onions that I started in late July and early August, and even some of the salad onions that I started in late August and even some of them into September. It's been a freaky year for onions for us. That means it was very warm over winter, not that many frosts, so there was a lot of growth, very strong growth. And when you get strong growth over winter, there's a fairly good chance things are going to bolt in spring, especially if you have a warm spring as well. So what am I doing about that? Well, I'm going to sow all of my overwintered onions a bit later this year. And I'm also going to sow some of them in the beginning of December. Now, I tried that this year, worked out really well. I got a really great crop a few weeks ago, so at the end of June. So that means I'll do a few sort of September time. Those are the ones we'll eat in May, and then I'll do my main batch, as I say, in December. Those are the ones we'll eat in late June and July. And of course, we'll still do our main crops just as we always do in February. Those are the ones we'll eat in August. So I'm fairly confident that that's going to work, and if it doesn't work, we'll just eat salad on spring onions, big spring onions. Next one was that the garlic got rust. Now, it wasn't too much of an issue. I always try to sow multiple batches of garlic in different locations in the hope that at least some of it won't get rust. But even if it does get rust, it's not really an issue. We just remove the outer leaves, and we harvested it just the same as always. Maybe the bulbs were slightly smaller than they were last year, but not appreciably so. So I'm not overly worried about that. I was a little bit more worried about the fact that my leeks got rust. So I'd only planted the leeks probably 3 or 4 weeks before I harvested the garlic. What did I do about that? Well, I was thinking maybe I'd have to even pull those leeks up and just scrap them and replant the bed. But what I found was that most of the leaves were clear, so I just pulled off all the outer leaves where I could see some evidence of rust, and I'm fingers crossed that it won't have spread to the rest of the leaves. So far, I'm not seeing any signs of it. What would I do again next year? Well, I don't think it mattered where I planted the leeks, because there was just rust across the whole of the allotment site. Rust is airborne, and so it doesn't really matter whether my garlic got rust, because garlic rust and leek rust is basically the same family, so they're transmissible between each other, but it's airborne, and so it doesn't really matter that they were in adjacent beds, because the plot next to mine had garlic with rust, and the plot over the way had garlic with rust, so it will just be blowing around in the air regardless. So there's not that much I can do apart from sow some leeks at home, because it's very unlikely that any other home gardeners have got garlic growing. So so that's the kind of hedge. I don't normally do leeks at home, but I think next year I will do a bed of leeks at home, and I'll do it away from the garlic. And then if we get garlic rust, then hopefully we won't get leek rust. So that's what I'm going to do. So I planted quite a lot of early cauliflowers, and we did 2 batches. We did a batch on Debbie's plot, we did a batch on my plot. The ones on Debbie's plot did great because they're in full sun. The ones on my plot, really, they didn't do very well. The heads were sort of this sort of size when we harvested them in May. Really small, and that was because of light levels. On my plot, especially in spring, the light levels are really low because we've got a big tree, there's a shed, there's an IBC tank, there's all sorts of stuff at the end of my plot, not on my plot, that shades my plot in spring. And so I'd chosen to put flowering brassicas in that most shady of beds. That was a big mistake. So next year I'll have to figure out where I can put my flowering brassicas, where they're going to get more light. It's a fairly easy fix. Yeah, I did some early onions in the polytunnel and I didn't do very well. Now, I put that down to the fact that I put them in October, which is when you normally plant out your seed sown onions. But it just was really warm in the polytunnel in October, and so they just didn't thrive. So I've got two options there, because the polytunnel is generally quite a good environment for early onions. One is just put them in a bit later, so put them in maybe towards the end of October when it's a bit cooler, and just leave them in module trays outside or in a cooler location. Or just don't do them in the polytunnel at all. So I'm kind of not quite sure, because I've just got a bed that's particularly good for early onions just in terms of its size and location in the polytunnel, but I might find something else to put in there. Early French beans, they lost all the leaves. Not really sure why. I think it might just be a virus or something, but basically the whole plant is kind of stripped of its leaves. It's only got leaves up in the canopy at the moment, whereas the dwarf French beans that are right next to the climbing French beans, they're fine. So I'm unsure. Never really had this problem in the past, but they're still throwing out plenty of beans for harvest, so I'm not overly worried about it. Also, I did an experiment growing super early French beans in the conservatory, and we did get them really early. I can't remember exactly, but it was sort of the end of April or the early May, very early May. So that's quite a lot earlier than I've ever had French beans before. But they were thin and spindly, and their actual kind of volume of the harvest was quite small. They didn't take up that much space, but I don't think I'll do them again. I don't think it's really worth it. I'm quite happy just to wait another few weeks and get a much bigger crop with less inconvenience. And the same, I would say, is true of the Shirley's Pixie tomatoes, which again I grew as an early crop, and not that early though, but I grew them basically for a harvest in May, and we didn't get a harvest in May, we got a harvest in June, but the plants grew huge in the kitchen on the windowsill. It's a really bright light in there, so it wasn't really that much that it was low in light levels, it was that it was too warm for them. So the combination, that if you've got a lot of heat, then you need a lot of light, is basically what it comes down to. So in this case, they had the heat, but they didn't have enough light. And that's the same in the conservatory for tomatoes. They always just grow huge, and the yield is really low. So I'm not going to bother with those. Tumbler, by contrast, which are a hanging basket kind of tomato, they did really well, and I started those in the conservatory, so they still had the same kind of lots of heat, not much light scenario, but I moved them into the polytunnel as soon as I could, and that was the key. And I'm not that healthy plants, so I wouldn't sort of want to do all of my tumblers in the polytunnel, because it is a little bit too warm for them at this time of year, but it still gave us a really nice early crop, so kind of beginning of June sort of time scale. And so I was really happy with those. We've been eating tomatoes much earlier than we've ever had them before. I might do a few more in hanging baskets in the future. So those were Tumbler, really great. Right, so I've always been in the habit of sowing a batch of carrots in August, moving them into the polytunnel sometime in sort of late September, in containers obviously, and then leaving them in the polytunnel to grow on, and then harvesting them in April at a time when I haven't got any more carrots left in the ground. Last year and the year before, that has not been wildly successful. It's worked in previous years, but it's the last 2 years it's not been great. And they take up a lot of space in the polytunnel, and I've just decided I'm not going to do them anymore. What I found was they were too dry, even though I'd watered them quite consistently. They weren't very big, they were very hairy. By contrast, I just left some of my Eskimo carrots in the ground, and they were fantastic all the way through April. And then sort of towards the end of April, I just harvested some of them, stuck them in some compost, and just kept on harvesting them from the compost basically. And they were great. So I'm definitely just going to do that in the future. Just sow a few more in the ground, move them when I need the bed, move them into just some containers full of compost, damp compost, and then just harvest them as needed. Much better than trying to start them in August. And so, yeah, that's a lesson learned. The benefit of that, of course, is they don't take up any space. They're just outside in the ground, largely unprotected. Whitefly, God, last year was the worst year ever for whitefly, and we had it all the way through winter as well and into early spring. It was an absolute nightmare. So far we haven't got any whitefly, which is, I don't know, I can't remember when it started actually last year, but I'm kind of fingers crossed it won't be as bad as it was last year. And what am I going to do about it? Well, there's not a lot you can do about it, to be honest. So the only thing I'm going to do is I am going to sow some of my brassicas really quite late, so towards the end of August, and I'm going to plant those on the allotment under a low tunnel in October time, and hopefully I'll be able to harvest those in spring. And if there's whitefly everywhere else, that bed of kales mainly should be relatively free of whitefly if I start them inside under grow lights, away from any kind of whitefly infestation, and then plant them out quite late. So that's the only thing that I'm thinking of doing. I did try sprays, I tried vacuuming, I tried all sorts of different things to control them. You know, it controlled them for a week and then they were just back again. It was a nightmare. So this year about 30% of my spring cabbages went to seed. It doesn't bother me a lot, that really, to be honest, because we just harvest them as spring greens and we really like the greens just as much as the hearted cabbages, to be honest. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to do some cabbages, spring cabbages. I'm going to start them in sort of January time under grow lights, and you know, then plant them out in March. And I don't think they'll be that far behind ones that I start actually in sort of July and August time, but I think the chances of them going to seed is vastly reduced. So I'm only going to do the spring cabbages that I really need early in late July and August, and I say the rest of them I'm going to do early next year, and I'm going to do a few successions of those as well. So, you know, in the past what I've always done is I've always done like all my spring cabbages in summer, and yeah, it just takes up a lot of space as well by comparison with starting them in January. Now I've not tested this start in January type of thing, but we'll see how it goes. Talking of starting brassicas in January, I always do start a batch of kales in January under grow lights, and I do that because I want to plant them out in March, which is when I start sowing my main crop kales. And I start them that early because I can put them under a low tunnel, which means I can start harvesting them just as my overwintered kales have all gone to seed. And that has all worked really well, and I've tried lots of different varieties for that. And over the years, I've found just a handful really that work really well. And the ones that I think work the best are dwarf green curly kale and black magic Tuscan kale. So those are the only ones that I'm going to start from now on. Although maybe I'll do just a couple of scarlet, but they do go to seed pretty quickly. Everything else I've tried goes to seed a little bit too early for me, although when you do start them that early, do expect them to go to seed in June. And so I always plan to have them pulled out of the ground and the ground replanted in July, which is what I'm about to do tomorrow, actually. Right, potatoes. So I do most of my potatoes in containers, and I've always had them in the back garden, or have for a few years. And the whole of the back garden is kind of dominated by these potato plants. And what I've decided to do this year is to get the potatoes all out of the back garden, so the back garden can focus more on looking like a really nice ornamental kitchen garden. Potatoes actually look really nice early on in the season, you know, when they're just nice, lush, healthy green. But of course they start to die back, they get bashed around by the wind and all that sort of thing, so they look really messy. So this year we put them on the drive, and the drive isn't really used for very much. We don't drive a car up and down it, for example. So we only need a sort of fairly narrow corridor down the drive. So what we decided to do was put all the potatoes down there, and it worked really well until the first spring storm, when they all got bashed around a lot, kind of what you would expect, but I hadn't really prepared very well for it. I knew I was going to put support strings in, but anyway, I didn't have anything kind of high enough to put the support strings in, high enough to support them properly. So next year, I think I'm still going to do them on the drive. I haven't harvested them yet, so I don't know how well they've done. But the light levels are a little bit low there, which means the plants are a little bit leggy there, which means they do get bashed around in the wind. So next year, really good support strings going to go in for the potatoes on the drive. Let's hope I get a good harvest as well. Yeah, so I had to use a bed for carrots this year that I'd previously grown golden purslane in. And that was a big mistake, because golden purslane is a prolific self-seeder, and so it's just masses and masses of weeding to do to weed out all that golden purslane. And ironically, my golden purslane that I sowed in modules hadn't actually germinated very well, so I was busy kind of planting out a grotty tray of modules of golden purslane at the same time as I was weeding them out of the carrot bed. But you know, that was just a really stupid planning mistake. Just have to be really conscious of which plants self-seed, and either plant them back in the same bed year after year, or don't plant something in there that isn't a good crop to be weeded around, like carrots, or harvest them before they seed. So anyway, that was a good lesson learned there. Ground elder. We're getting a lot of ground elder on our site. It seems to be spreading everywhere. All I can think is that it's going to seed, and people aren't, you know, cutting it back before it goes to seed, and the seed's blowing around all over the place, and it's getting established in pockets everywhere, and it's just sort of spreading. You know, ground elder is just one of those crops, very, very difficult to deal with. But yeah, I mean, I'm not really sure what to do with it, because it's on other people's plots. I can't do anything about it when it's on other people's plots, and then they let it go to seed, and yeah, it's cropping up on my plot now. Mare's tail. It really does make summer gardening for me a chore. That is one of the reasons why I really like gardening over, well, all year round, because in autumn, winter and spring there's almost no mare's tail, and I kind of forget about how bad it is, and then by the time we get to the end of spring, it's just such a chore to be weeding it out. My plot is absolutely infested with mare's tail, and people keep, you know, saying, oh, just keep pulling it up and eventually it'll get tired and, you know, it won't be as much of a problem. But for the moment, it's as vigorous as anything, and yeah, it just keeps on going, and I really don't know what to do about it. But I've tried all sorts of things. I even injected salt down into the stems, and it just came back. So anyway, I don't know, just keep pulling it up, keep pulling it up. But yeah, you know, it's one of the reasons why, as I say, I can really just take a rest from gardening in summer. We still obviously harvest everything that we need to eat, but I'm just not so passionate about it, because I just can't stand that constant weeding. I do it, but I don't enjoy it. I broke the leader off one of my tomatoes. Now everybody does it, but then the tomato next to that, I hadn't got it blown off, got knocked around in the wind a bit, and the string just kind of, I don't know, just ripped the leader off. So I've got 2 plants where I lost the leaders, and I just taken all the side shoots off those plants. So I'm just kind of patiently waiting for new side shoots to grow up. But yeah, so Steve Digwell Greenfingers, he said, it's an old adage for gardeners, and I'm not an old gardener, so I don't really know these old words of wisdom, that you always tie in your tomatoes before you take the side shoots out. So if you do accidentally snap them off, at least you can use a side shoot and let that grow on. So but it also made me think my strings are getting very tight on some of the tomatoes, so I've started using a few clips rather than winding the strings around all the time, because they just get tighter and tighter and tighter, and yeah, it's a bit of a challenge. So yeah, just a little successional thing for me is that I need to split my last batch of spinach into 2 sowings 3 weeks apart, because we had 2 weeks without spinach this year, and yeah, that would have just, and we had loads and loads of spinach, and then we had no spinach, and by just splitting that succession into 2, that would be a really good idea. Now, keeping records is basically the lesson learned for that I work really quite hard to make sure that I learn from year to year. So people keep thinking that I'm really organised, but I'm not really organised. What I am is just a good record keeper. I just keep records from year to year, make sure that I'm refining my gardening system, my garden timings, and the sizes of my successional sowings, so that I keep a nice steady supply of veg all year round. And it's not a huge amount of work each year, but over the last 6 years it's really kind of accumulated, so that I've got quite a nice refined easy system, and I don't need to be very organised, because the system organises me. And that's different, because I am just by nature not a very organised person. I just need a system there running in the background, reminding me of what I need to do. And then the final thing I can think of is that I got a bit carried away with interplanting. Now, I really like interplanting. I really recommend interplanting and relay planting and progressive thinning and all these different advanced growing techniques, but I got a bit carried away. I interplanted down the centres of my brassica beds, thinking, well, there's plenty of time for these plants to grow to maturity before the brassicas kind of take over the bed. I just always underestimate how fast brassicas grow. And so the lettuces that I planted down the centre just got overwhelmed so quickly, and that was same as the onions. So yeah, well, I suppose that was a lesson I almost knew, I think, but I just have spare plants and I just hate to compost them, and I'd given away all that I could, and so I thought, well, nothing lost, just try it out. Didn't work. So that is what went wrong in the first half of the year. My name's Steve, this is the Seaside Kitchen Garden and Allotment channel, and I'll see you soon.